Once upon a time, I think we had this idea that we are going to very specifically be able to attribute every single user down to every single touch point, right? This was the multi-touch era where people started building these really complicated, I would argue, marginally useful models. I will know the 30 touch points this person had before they even reach my product. And of course, only at a certain point did we step back and say, is that even useful? What can we do with that? Can we actually orchestrate 30 different touch points if that's my best user of all time? And the answer is
welcome to Experimental, the podcast that cuts through the noise to bring you actionable insights in B2C growth, marketing, and data science. I'm your host, Sundar, former head of brand data science at Uber and the mind behind the Experimental newsletter. Join me as I talk with industry leaders who have driven growth at companies like Uber, Spotify, and Netflix. We'll uncover the experiments, failures, and breakthroughs that lead to real results. Now, let's get experimental. Today, my guest is Adam Miller. He's led user acquisition teams at companies like Uber, Turo, and Postmates. He's also an investor and advisor to growth companies, and he's now currently a founder. With that, I welcome Adam Miller to Experimental. Adam, it's great to have you on. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Sundar.
Well, obviously, the most exciting thing is to have someone who's done user acquisition at 3 different world-class marketplaces, Postmates, Turo, and Uber. And I think I'd love to just start there. So tell me a little bit about your experiences there, when you came into these companies, what they were going through, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, so I came into each of those companies at very different stages in their growth cycle. A little bit of background on me. I got my career start in an agency world. So I basically started doing a lot of paid user acquisition, lead gen, even branding for a lot of big pharmaceutical companies, and eventually found myself in travel, doing a lot of work for Disney and eventually Expedia. And that's how I kind of got a foot in the door with Turo. At the time, it was called Relay Rides. They were looking for somebody to really help with their mobile acquisition efforts. And it just so happened I was doing that for almost 2 years prior with Expedia. And, coming into then Relay Rides, now Turo, they were really just getting off the ground. In fact, I love to tell this story. Whenever I told my aunt the kind of company I was about to go to, she was like, that's crazy. Who would ever give their car to a stranger and just let them drive away in it? Like, that's nuts. Of course, fast forward 4 or 5 years later, and she goes, oh my God, I saw you on TV. That's amazing. And all of a sudden you realize just how after a company grows into its own, that really validates it in the minds of people who otherwise would have never been an adopter of that company to begin with. I was at Turo for almost 5 years. With Postmates, I came in really right at the very end. I had joined just as COVID was getting underway. And obviously that took off like a rocket ship, only because, overnight delivery went from this luxury to a utility very, very quickly. And I was maybe on the job for 6 to 8 months. And then we got the call from Uber that suddenly we were going to be acquired. So I spent the latter half of my first year at that company really just managing that acquisition. And then stayed on with Uber for another 2 years. And again, managing it through COVID was a very different time than every other time prior. We were trying to figure out how to load balance between delivery and rides at a time when restrictions were changing almost weekly. And so again, just very different times in their life cycle. But honestly, it was amazing. And there were a lot of lessons learned from every experience.
Yeah, and I think I'd love to go deeper on the COVID stuff in particular. But really quick question on Uber, I think you were leading supply side acquisition. Was that also true at Turo and Postmates?
So at Turo, I was actually doing both. So for quite, or at least most of my time there, I was really focused on load balancing, right? Demand and supply, really across the US. And then later in the life cycle of the company, we ended up expanding to the UK and Canada. And so that became its own challenge, especially because we weren't nationwide. And even in the US, for a period of time, we weren't able to operate in the state of New York. So that was its own challenge. At Postmates, yes, I did both, at least for the year or so that I was at that company and really just managing, again, that acquisition. And then at Uber, yes, I was exclusively focused on the supply side, and I was kind of given this one like very specific role to look across the entire globe and say, okay, where do we need to, what are the levers we have in each country with respect to their given growth prospects? And how do we put more couriers or drivers into each country based on the budgets and the regional imperatives at that time?
Yeah, my mind is racing. I feel like I'm going to have so many questions. So let's start with Turo, right? At the time you said it was Relay Rides. What did you see? Like, why did you join them?
So I was really taken with the story. One of the trends, or I could say one of the patterns in all the companies I've been a part of over the last 15 years is I love this idea of creating a company that's built around putting money into everyday people's pockets, right? This idea that you can create this platform that does genuinely generate income on behalf of them. And when I saw, relay rides at that time, I was like, this is perfect, right? I'd had terrible experiences with like not even car payments, but just the insurance, just the upkeep of a car. It's ridiculously expensive. And again, I always apply this like macroeconomic lens to almost everything. And in my mind, I was like, well, wait a minute, people are paying a lot to upkeep these cars. They are a depreciating asset. How can people get that money back in some way? And that's really what I was taken with in the early days of relay rides. And candidly, whenever I think about the sort of serendipity that happened at that time, I just happened to meet a gentleman by the name of Andrew Mock. He was the CMO over there for years and years. And that led to a meeting with Andre Haddad, who's this incredible CEO over there. And again, they just sold me on the story so quickly.
Yeah. So you go in, right? You're asked to sort of help drive user acquisition. Walk us through what that journey is like.
Yeah, so the first thing you have to do when you're creating a category like that is really explain the mechanics of what somebody is going to experience when they come in to that kind of marketplace, right? So on the supply side, the biggest challenge is how do we describe why somebody should list their car, right? And the obvious answer in all these marketplaces is earnings, right? People aren't going to do this out of the goodness of their heart, right? There's the opportunity to generate real income for themselves, and especially again off this depreciating asset. For the demand side, we had to find really creative ways to differentiate ourselves and set ourselves apart from traditional car rental, right? And so you think about some of the phrases that we really leaned into, and even some of the imagery we leaned into in the really early days. You think about this idea of more cars in more places. That was something that we could really promise and deliver on, because we could put cars in like really remote areas. You think of like Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, or you think about like these like remote places in like Montana. In fact, my old party trick used to be tell me a location and I bet I can find a car within 20 miles of it on Turo. That was in the early days. And I would just go to events and just show that to people and they were just blown away. Especially when they're like, oh, I grew up in this like really small rural town. Oh my goodness, you have cars nearby. So that was a really big selling proposition. The other one was the selection of cars. So in very Airbnb fashion, I would put Lamborghinis and of course all kinds of exotic cars into a lot of our Facebook ads and a lot of our advertising materials, knowing full well that somebody was probably just going to walk away with like a Honda Fit, which again, no hating on Honda Fits. I have one in my garage right now. But it's this idea that as soon as you see something like that, you immediately understand, you connect the dots as to how this is different, right? And the only reason why I call it the Airbnb trick is because, let's face it, Airbnb really set themselves apart from traditional hoteliers by simply showing you things like castles and these really incredible, like outlandish, vacation spots. In reality, most people are just going to book an apartment in Manhattan.
Right. And did you own the entire funnel? Did you own just the ad side of it? Like what piece of the puzzle did you get to oversee?
Yeah, so in the early days, I was brought on to manage the app acquisition. So the company had this thesis that app could be a big thing, but they weren't quite sure. I think, like a lot of companies, and again, this was early 2015, I think a lot of companies were still trying to figure out, is app an acquisition channel or is it more of a retention communication mechanism? And so they already had the acquisition side on the web, like running quite well, but they kept looking at app and going like, are we actually acquiring people into this? Or is this more of like a cross sell opportunity where once we onboard some owner or even some guest, can we just give them this app as a mechanism by which they transact? And of course, I came in with a very strong opinion of saying, no, this is an acquisition channel. I can even show you how to do this. And again, a funny Andrew story. At my 1 year review, he goes, we weren't even sure if this was going to be a thing. We weren't even sure if you're going to make it work. I was like, well, thank God I did.
Hey, quick one. If you've ever questioned whether your marketing is actually driving growth, you're not alone. I Write Experimental, a weekly newsletter for B2C marketers to run smarter experiments and cut wasted spend. There's a free version to get you started and a paid tier if you want deeper case studies and behind the scenes breakdowns. Scan the QR code or click the link in the description to join. Now, back to the show. Yeah. And is that because you had experience from Expedia? Because again, you've got Turo, in my mind, is not the same use cases like an Uber where you request a ride, you sign up and you download the next day. Like there's a little bit longer of a funnel potentially. Like, is that something that you were able to leverage from Expedia?
Absolutely. And I think you're right to hit on this. So travel is very seasonal, right? And so it comes in waves. And so you almost have to acquire ahead of when you expect that wave to hit, right? So if you're expecting, again, especially in the US and North America, usually the big travel season starts in Q2 and ends in Q3. I mean, it's like clockwork, right? It really starts to pick up in May, June, as you would expect. And then usually peak month for everybody is usually right around September, sometimes like the first week of October. Really depends on weather patterns. But you almost want to acquire ahead of that so that way people have this in their pocket before they start thinking about a trip. And then that's a real opportunity to come in with engagement and really start pushing that. But yeah, I picked up a lot of that from my time at Expedia.
Okay. Something I want to pull a little bit on is, what channels were you focusing on? Like, how did you set up the campaigns? And I'd also like to follow that up with like, what does that look like now? Have you seen a big shift in how user acquisition should be done now? So yeah, let's start with how you were thinking about it in 2015.
Yeah, in 2015, again, because we had to build this category, it was a lot of paid social. I mean, paid social is the easiest way to like push this message out, using a lot of great tools that Facebook was building at the time. Twitter at the time was building. And again, this was like early days of mobile acquisition. I mean, I just come from a company called Amobi that doesn't even do that much in mobile anymore. But Amobi was like one of those companies that had figured out a way to track app installs before even Google Ad ID, before IDFA. Like it was truly the Wild West of like mobile acquisition. So you have to think about these tools in the state that they were, 10 years ago, even greater than 10 years ago. So it was a lot of audience targeting that worked really well. But of course, I would say towards the end of my tenure there, of course, along came these tools like Google UAC, right? That was just an absolute monster. And I remember when they started rolling that out, we were like, I don't know, this seems kind of sus. Like it didn't really quite work the way that they'd advertised. But of course, over time, they got it working really, really well. And it became one of our bigger channels. But yeah, mobile acquisition was one of those channels. I looked at it through the lens of a travel company and thought, how could you do without a really robust mobile acquisition strategy? And then the one I almost neglected to mention is, of course, Apple Search. Like Apple Search was, candidly like shooting fish in a barrel for a period of time, especially when they first rolled out that beta. I mean, it was so cheap and so good.
Yeah. And was the product also mobile friendly? Was it mobile first? Have they built positioned it that way?
Not at first. So not at first. And this is when I knew that we were really onto something. Towards the end of my time with the company, there were a lot of people who would come onto the platform, especially hosts. These were, folks who owned vehicles. They would say, I didn't even know you had a website. And that for me was like, great, we've done it. Like we've fully like switched this company over to like being a mobile first company. And I think whenever I joined, only, maybe only around 30 or 40% of all the revenue in the company was flowing through the mobile app, or at least touched the mobile app in any way. By the time I left, I mean, it was the vast majority of it.
Yeah, and just from like a audience perspective, like what kind of insights were you looking at? What kind of segmentation? Like how did you think about this is who I want to target to acquire from a mobile strategy?
Yeah, so there's something kind of paradoxical, I would say, in car rental in that, um, obviously younger people tend to be far worse drivers. They are effectively the risk in the equation. And at the end of the day, one of the things you are managing is like obviously risk. And you're trying to think about like what is that sweet spot of person that is really open-minded about technology and these new experiences, like the would-be Airbnb host, the would-be Airbnb guest that might also want to try something like Turo, but is also not so young. They're not 19 years old. And, obviously they're a much better driver than that. And we ended up finding this sweet spot right around like 30. Like, I mean, these were people who were just old enough, had a lot of disposable income, would take trips of like weeks at a time if they had that kind of vacation. And they would rent really nice cars too. And the other population that comes to mind is international travelers. So when international travelers would come to the US, they would, of course, want to do like a couple of like really iconic trips. They would want to take like the road to Hana on like a Jeep, right? Or they would want to rent a Mustang or a Camaro and drive it down the one. And it's incredible when you see those patterns show up in the data. You're like, okay, it's not just my imagination. Like this is really the trip that a lot of these people want to take, and they're willing to spend quite a bit on it.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. So shifting now towards you've seen almost a decade of user acquisition, right? A lot of the I guess literature, if you will, or advice is like, hey, just like, let Meta do its thing. Do you subscribe to that? Like what does user acquisition in 2025 look like to you?
Yeah, I do subscribe to that. If anything, I put it to people like this: you will never be able to consume the amount of data that Meta sees in a day.
Mhm.
And so the idea that you somehow know better is foolish at best. Not only are these algorithms built by these companies for their advertisers, so not only are they, they're proprietary and they're built on their data sets, but they're looking at the data in very, I would say, counterintuitive and even non-intuitive ways, right? So you as an advertiser might say, well, I know my audience, right? I know that they're going to be, 20 to 25 years old and they live in these populations, et cetera. But the reality is Facebook's going to be able to find you that incremental opportunity that doesn't exist in that population. Number one. And number two, as anybody who's been media buying for long enough knows, media buying is basically an economics marketplace. There's supply, there's demand. When you constrain supply, your price goes up. So you're better off just going broad, letting the algorithm do its thing, let it find those opportunities. And honestly, it creates this incredible win-win situation. Facebook obviously gets to maximize yield against populations that, that otherwise would probably not get served that ad. And you find those incremental opportunities at the most efficient price. And I tend to also think about this in terms of, what is the end game for 2025, you asked? At some point, yes, I do think Facebook, Google, and there's even some late breaking news from Amazon now, they're getting really good at automating ad creation. That's always been the bottleneck. So when you think about pairing this ad creation with this automated audience bidding and even automated, could call it like audience discovery mechanism, my goodness, like that's great. I remember one time an advertiser pushed back on me in this idea and they're like, look, I really want to maintain this control. And that makes a lot of sense. Like we are naturally control freaks, especially when you're in user acquisition, because you want to think about everything in such fine grained detail. But the reality is that by letting go of some of that control, you could probably actually go and deliver better outcomes. And at the end of the day, we have to deliver those outcomes.
Yeah. And an expert like you who's seen this across many different companies, different industries, you come in, obviously, like a lot of what you're saying can be automated. Like, where's the value that you add?
Yeah, I think a lot of the value is still figuring out which tool to pull off the shelf. Even if a lot of that fine grained detail is again being slowly but surely automated. If you think about almost setting a plane on autopilot from takeoff to landing, there's probably a lot of stuff in between there that you can just autopilot, right? You're not going to necessarily have to watch it 24/7. However, there are definitely some maneuvers that you're going to want to have your hands on the controls in case something goes wrong, or candidly, when something goes wrong. It's not if, it's more when. And you're going to want to be able to adjust that. I'll give you a great example. Even today with Facebook and Google, you can set a max budget, but they will tell you, and again, a lot of advertisers don't really pay attention to this, but they will tell you up front, on any given day, we could spend 2x your budget and still be within budget, right? Well, when you see it do that, sometimes you have to understand, like, okay, is this going to self-correct, or am I going to have to insert myself here and correct it? So that's one way. The other ways are that, look, you're still going to have creative fatigue, right? No matter what. And you're still going to have creative concept fatigue even within that. So you do need to continuously ship new creative and new concepts, even if it's an AI that is creating that creative in the first place. You still have to guide these processes in a way. It's a long way of saying, like, you may not need as many of us. You're still going to need a couple.
Yeah. Piggybacking on the creative, like walk me through your own process, like how you as a growth specialist, like what is your process to create better creatives?
Yeah, for me, I start from a place of what are my UVPs? Like, and again, I approach this as like a ruthlessly rational, very pragmatic, marketer. And I think about what are the UVPs and what are the things that are really resonating from a messaging standpoint? Like if I were to put just 10 different phrases in front of you, what is the actual thing that is going to resonate, just holding everything else the same? And then once you find that message, then you really double, triple, quadruple down on it. Like go out and create videos against it. Go out and create different imagery against that one particular message, right? I'll give you a great example. One of the things we realized early on in Turo's trajectory was that this idea of like rent better cars was going to be a really big deal. Why? Because we truly believed our cars were better than everyone else's. Or delivery. Delivery ended up being a really big product. It ended up being, actually, it was a product that came from within the community itself. A lot of people we saw were just doing this organically. And then we decided to obviously lean into it. We productized it. Then we started marketing it. And so when you realize what those like real differentiators are, those are things I tend to lean into. But once you find those one or two phrases or those one or two pieces of the product that are really resonating, then you just go and double down on it. You build out a whole suite of creative against that.
Okay. And that's a bit more testing and just trying and necessarily being like, I have a strong view.
Yeah, I don't think opinions are actually worth very much, honestly, in this world. Like, I think a lot of people have a lot of opinions, and my response is always go and test it. Like, bring back some data that shows that that's real. And it's okay if you have a gut feeling, but like, go test that gut feeling.
Yeah. Something that you mentioned that you seem very successful at was being able to work with product, bridge the gap, which I don't find a lot of marketers do. Like, do you have like a framework or how have you been able to interact and sort of liaise with product to be a better marketer?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. So I think you have to constantly be in touch with your PMs, right? You have to constantly be looking at what is coming down the pike and not pretending like, oh, that feature doesn't matter. It absolutely matters. And again, this is where I think a lot of marketers would differentiate between like, oh, there's brand marketing, there's direct response or performance marketing. I do buy that. But the reality is if you're on the performance side, that means that every single feature that gets shipped, that is something new for you to talk to your users about, right? And especially even if you're talking about lifecycle marketing too, right? Every feature is something new to talk about. And especially if it adds value, and you would hope it would add value to the experience that these people that you're bringing in are actually having, right? And to me, that is really that's the sort of linkage. You have to be able to just work closely with your PMs and understand what is actually happening within that product and also how it's changing. You might be messaging something that is no longer a differentiator. You might actually be leaning into something that is old news. And you might be, even just because it's getting a response on the ad layer, you might be making a promise that the product can't keep. And it's that linkage that's always so important to keep.
That's something I want to emphasize what you said, which is I know, like you mentioned, creative fatigue is common, and something is marketers don't often have new ideas. But if you're working with your PMs, like you can just essentially say, okay, let me find a new way to frame a new feature, or and then that in itself becomes a new creative lens that you can use. I love that. I think that's great. One thing that I think would be very stupid of me not to take advantage of is the fact that you have worked at so many cool companies. Any cool stories that you can share?
Boy, I've got a ton of cool stories. Trying to think of like what the wildest one is. All right, this is a funny one from Turo. I remember at the time we were looking at podcasting, right? We were looking at podcast advertising. And at the time, the comedian Hannibal Buress, I guess, had tried to get a car and was on his podcast and talking about Turo, just talking about it. And he had this co-host named Tony Trim, and Tony would come up with these funny little beats that Hannibal would like kind of half rap over. And at that point, they actually came up with a funny little Turo song. And we're like, what is going on here? And so, of course, we called the reps and we decided to sponsor his podcast. Fast forward, we ended up actually shooting a full length ad with him where he performed, he actually expanded on the song that he initially like kind of riffed on and ended up just creating this like whole tune just out of thin air. And it was amazing. I'll send you the ad. Like it's probably been mostly scrubbed from the internet, but I'm sure there's a YouTube link around. But I remember one day I had just come back from a conference. I would walk into our office and there's Hannibal hanging out just eating pizza. And he was super sketched out because the office was decorated for Halloween. I guess the office had had a Halloween party the night before. He's like, what is going on here? Like, you have to imagine Hannibal Buress just being like weirded out by the fact there's cobwebs and tombstones everywhere while he's just like, hey, is anybody gonna eat that pizza? And he just
Yeah.
hung out.
If you don't know him, he's just got this like deadpan comedy. He's super funny. That's amazing. And did you run that ad for a while? Like, how did you take advantage of that?
Yeah, we did. I mean, we definitely ran it online. Of course, it got like a great response. I think it really hit home with like the Instagram, YouTube community at the time. But it was just such a funny moment, especially because the ad opens with him literally painting a picture of himself. It's just truly the most bizarre, but like so cool and like so funny thing ever.
Yeah. One thing I've been thinking about as you said this, right, is in 2025, like you've got organic social as like a big play. Was this a very common thing when you were doing user acquisition, at Turo and Postmates?
I'd say right around that time, like influencer culture like really started. We started talking about micro influencers. We started talking about going out and doing deals with a lot of other media brands that were really starting to build their own brands on top of YouTube, on top of Instagram. That really wasn't as prevalent at that time. I mean, we're talking maybe 2016, 2017. Now it's obviously commonplace, now that people have seen the rise of people like, Mr. Beast, this idea of building a media brand on these platforms alone is not novel. One of the companies we've been partnered with was a company called Donut Media, and we started leveraging their audience and also just a fantastic partnership with their host. He would do these wild introductions, and we would give them cars that they just didn't have access to. So I remember at the time the Tesla Model 3 had just come out. They really wanted to test drive one and do a whole review on it. So of course we hooked them up with a Model 3, and that campaign did fantastic. So again, you've seen this real evolution in terms of how these influencers are really building out their, not just their following, but also how advertisers are starting to interact with them. And I would say, not to give ourselves too much credit, but I think we had one of the more organic interactions with these influencers early on.
That's amazing. And did that evolve over time? Like, is that something you push for early, or did it just like you said organically come? Like, how did that relationship build?
Yeah, those relationships ended up manifesting themselves in like multi-year relationships. So, we started seeing a lot of traction with the first one, and then we just kept going with it. And again, like at some point, all these channels do reach a saturation point. And so you do have to keep moving and keep thinking about, where's my organic reach? How can I continue to push on this? But again, it's a little bit different only because it was a partnership, but we are leveraging their organic reach. And I think it hit a little bit differently than just doing a tried and true ad.
So you're an advisor. You're going in and you're helping founders. Like, what is your process? Like, what is the biggest mistake founders are still making when it comes to user acquisition?
I think they're doing it too early. So user acquisition isn't really something, when I think about user acquisition, that's obviously a very broad category. But when I think about doing it too early, a lot just lean on paid. Like paid
Hmm.
marketing is never the first thing you want to lean with. You really have to build some sort of organic base that you're going to talk to over and over and over again. If you're not building that organic base, stop doing paid ads and go and do that. Because if you, especially look across the spectrum at the companies that are being funded, usually they have some sort of fervent audience. And sometimes they don't even know what they're selling to this audience. Sometimes they're not selling anything at all. They're just going a mile deep and an inch wide into one particular topic. And then they turn around several years later and they've got millions upon millions of followers. And then they decide to come up with some sort of company. And right there, they've already got their audience. And that's obviously incredibly powerful because you don't really have to pay for that audience. The audience already exists. So my number one piece of advice would be, go build that audience. Make sure you know where that audience is living, and don't just rely on paid advertising. Because I think everybody who's done this for long enough knows paid advertising just doesn't scale exponentially. It scales linearly, and it's a nice to have, but it's not a must have. If you don't have organic traffic, you really are going to struggle to find any real profitability.
That's amazing, especially from someone that is a user acquisition specialist. But marketplaces are notorious for having cold start problems. How do you think about the context of what you just said for marketplaces?
Yeah, I think it's fine if you're going to go out and acquire your first couple of users using paid advertising. But I always caution, I'll even couch what I just said, because what ends up happening is founders will take that to the nth degree. They will find it hard to wean themselves off of it, right? Because let's face it, if you're a founder, you love growth, right? You love growing your company, you love seeing the numbers tick up day over day, month over month, year over year. But the reality is that you at some point have to put a flag in the sand and say, we are not going to go beyond this point with just a paid strategy. Right. It's fine to parallel path a lot of things early on. Like, that's understandable. But at a certain point, you have to rip the Band-Aid off and not get addicted to just spending dollars for every single user you bring in. Right. And that's where you have to give credit to a lot of these companies that have figured out, like, yes, we can do referral programs. Right. That ends up being a force multiplier on top of our paid advertising. We can go and, again, drive to a lot of these organic channels, especially if it's through Meta. Right. You obviously have like an Instagram audience. There's a lot of evidence that whenever you go and you spend $1 on advertising, your audience will grow on some of these accounts, right? That's great, right? Go and get a followership. Again, there's different ways to think about that dollar in terms of force multiplier, but you really have to think about, at what point are you going to pull that Band-Aid off and not become so addicted to spending capital.
Yeah. Okay. One of the things we had chatted about before was you have a lot of contrarian takes that a year ago felt very contrarian, but now have made you look really smart, which you are, of course. What are some of those? What are the biggest ones that you were like, not so contrarian anymore?
I think probably the biggest one, a little less than a year ago, I really started beating the drum on this. So a little bit about me. I'm calling you from exotic Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I grew up in a very blue collar household. I even call it a painfully blue collar household. Grew up in a commercial construction business, that kind of thing. And whenever I think about where young people are today, I always looking a little skeptical at their choices for higher education, and especially to go to college. And so a little under a year ago, I started asking the question, like, why aren't more people going to vocational training? Why aren't they going to trade schools? Things like that. Mind you, the AI boom wasn't nearly what it is today. But to me, a couple obvious things just stood out, right? One, the debt to income ratio. It most universities or from most university graduates has just absolutely ballooned over the last 17 years. I mean, it's up, I believe, around 50%, right? So literally on average, your bachelor's degree is worth about 50% less than it was, just 17 years ago. On top of it, we've now accrued $1.8 trillion in federal debt. It's unclear to me how that gets paid back in any way from any source. It's $1.8 trillion. And whenever I looked at what your average trade school grad was making after graduating, I mean, it was as much as a bachelor's degree. So, like, to me, there was a real imbalance there. And I think that is starting to get through to a lot of people. Like, you don't necessarily have to go to college to be super successful. And it's really interesting, especially to see Gen Z and their career choices, or I'd say lack of career choice. I've met a lot of young people who are just like, I don't really believe in the idea of a career. Like, I want to learn a lot of things and then figure out how to best apply that. So look, it's a long way of saying, like, I truly believe in college. Like, yes, I'm a product of a 4-year degree. But I also think that, like a lot of things, we've taken it to its nth degree where it's probably no longer as valuable as we would like to believe. So actually, I believe that there's a real future for a lot of people if they want to do something that's a lot more, I'd say, incremental from a post-secondary education standpoint. Like, go and do something for a year first before you decide to dive, both feet in and take 4 years of your life and $100,000 to just go and just spend, in a classroom setting. Like, go try something else. Go get a couple certificates. Go, or even certifications, like full-on industry certifications, and try your hand at something before you necessarily make that decision. I hope that that's starting to shift, and I really think it is.
Yeah. First off, a quick shout out to my alma mater, Carnegie Mellon, which is in Pittsburgh. So I've strong roots to Pittsburgh. But I hear you, and I think the challenge is this notion that you need college, right? Do you find that that sort of sentiment itself is changing, like both from like workplaces saying, "Hey, you don't need a degree," and maybe parents feeling the same? Like, is that something you're seeing shifting as well?
Yes. So I think for a long time, what you saw in, especially in career culture, was what we call degree inflation, right? So this idea that jobs that didn't at one point require a college degree all of a sudden did. Why? Because it was just this blunt filter that you could apply to every single rec and say, well, if you don't have a college degree, like, you're just not going to be a good fit. It didn't have anything to do with your skill set, didn't have anything to do with what you knew or what you could apply on the job. It just had to do with this, like, very blunt filter. So I think that is changing. I think you're seeing a lot of evidence that this degree inflation is starting to reverse, but it's going to have to reverse because this year, and especially if you read a lot of what the colleges are saying, they're saying they had a record number of applicants. And of course they did. Why? Because we just graduated the largest US high school graduating class of all time, right? Just under 4 million students. From here, that goes down and to the right. And that's just due to secular population decline. So realistically, these companies, if they really want to hire bright young people, can't afford to have that, that filter for much longer, because we're talking about fewer people in existence.
Yeah, and so share with me. I think that's what your startup is working on. If we're allowed, are we allowed to talk about it?
We can talk a little bit about it. I won't talk too much about it, but yes, I mean, really what we're talking about is an alternative to traditional education. I think right now there are a lot of incredibly promising things that the AI helps us do that we couldn't have done before this moment. And the number one thing that I see it doing is being this one-to-one sort of teaching assistant, right? I think prior to this, you think about the experience of sitting in a classroom with, 20, 30 other people, and that teacher then has to teach you the lowest common denominator, but not with AI. With AI, suddenly I can take that teaching and apply it to where I am at any given moment, right? So if I don't know, if the rest of the class is at stage 4 and I'm still at stage 2, I can use that as a tutor to help me get from stage 2 up to stage 4, right? And there are other ways in which you can work in the communal, like even cohort-based way of learning, especially if you want to lean on your peers.
Thanks for sharing. That makes a lot of sense. Is there another contrarian view that you've seen play out to your favor over the past year?
Yeah. So interestingly enough, I spent almost actually more than 10 years in the Bay Area, and I love the Bay Area. I can't wait to go back. But I do get a little bit concerned about what's happening, I'd say, like on the coast, and not for any real like political or like lifestyle reason. I think what's actually happening is like the coasts are just becoming rapidly, I mean, they're already unaffordable, but I think more people are going to start coming into the middle of the country. I think that's only because, again, I have family that lives out west, but one of the most, I'd say, eye-opening experiences I've ever had in my life is when I got my home non-renewed in California because it was at risk of burning from wildfire. And when you think about that happening all up and down the West Coast or even parts of the West, like, Arizona and New Mexico and Utah and Colorado, right? It's happening almost everywhere. You think about people moving inland, not because they want to, but because they have to. Similar things are also happening in places like Texas. They're happening in places like Florida, especially due to hurricane danger. So you think about these like highly populated states and what their real estate markets look like, they have to be re-underwritten. Like they're way overvalued relative to the actual risk of natural disaster. So what I think you're going to see is actually a lot of young people moving inland to places like the Midwest or even like the North, it's called like North Central US, in places like Dakota, right? These are like these very sparsely populated places, but they are inherently insulated from extreme weather events in a way that the coasts are very much exposed to. So I think you're going to see massive population migration.
Obviously, Pittsburgh is not necessarily on the coast, but like, what does 2025, the rest of 2025 look like for you? Are you thinking of relocating? What's top of mind for you?
No, I love Pittsburgh. It's great. Again, I've got three little kids, so they're very comfortable here, as are me and my wife. So super stoked to be here. Again, this was a very conscious decision for us to come back here. Uh, but yeah, I would love to make it back to California one day, but this is great.
Adam, thanks for sharing. One thing that I would love to dig into a bit more is, again, this interaction between supply and demand load balancing that you've now had to face in multiple marketplaces. Like, what what metrics are you looking at to do that? Like, at what frequency? Like, are you trying to balance on a daily, a weekly, monthly? Like, what sort of cadence are you looking to balance?
Yeah, I think it depends on the marketplace, but the number one, let's say, metric that you're going to look at is utilization rate. If you only have so much supply available at any given time, and it's pretty obvious that the demand is outstripping that supply, it's a really clear indicator. You just need a lot more of that supply. And let's face it, not all supply is created equal. Yeah, and it depends on whether or not you're in a labor or, let's say, asset-based marketplace, how fungible that supply ultimately is, right? Let's face it, in more commoditized marketplaces like Uber or even Postmates, your supply side is actually quite fungible, right? But in asset-based marketplaces, not so much. And we used to talk all the time at Turo about how, we need the right supply in the right places, right? A Corvette, or let's say a convertible, is really only so useful in places like, yeah, like Pennsylvania, so many months out of the year. Like realistically, there's another 6 months out of the year in which like you're not even going to want to drive it, right? So you do think about the right supply in the right places and what's actually in demand in that moment. But that utilization rate, you always have to come back to it. And in terms of how frequently you look at it, I mean, you could look at it daily if you're in a peak season. I've definitely even been in marketplaces where you look at it hourly because you are trying to load balance for those times of peak demand. And that's where it's really important to have some sort of flex in that supply chain so that you can actually bring on more supply whenever that demand does spike. That's where you see Uber and even companies like DoorDash and previously Postmates leaning into things like incentives, right? You need people driving at the times when you need them.
And so at Turo, what level of granularity are you looking at supply and demand? For example, like you said, Corvette at this certain time. Like, are you looking at luxury cars on a weekly basis in the city? Like, what were the sort of attributes you could look at in terms of optimizing a marketplace?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of dimensions on which you can ultimately do that optimization. We wouldn't look at it that fine grained all the time, only because you are talking about travel seasonality, right? So it's going to come in waves more like weeks and months and not necessarily by day. But we would dive all the way down to the make and the model classification. You could even think about it in terms of price points, right? There are obviously some cars that can command north of $1,000 a day. There's some cars they wouldn't be able to command more than $50 a day. And so it just really depends.
Okay. And when you stayed at Turo for almost 5 years, what did user acquisition towards the end look like? Like, how was it different from the beginning?
Yeah, so in the beginning, my mandate was purely mobile. Towards the end, it was a little bit of everything, honestly. So you're talking about looking at things from quite frankly, a less biased lens, right? Because when you're just like really zoomed in on like your one little corner of this whole thing, you're just trying to think about how to get this one little piece working a little bit harder. When you're looking at it in terms of a portfolio and almost a portfolio of portfolios, you're trying to optimize for some efficient frontier across everything, right? And so you're having to load balance, not just between platforms, between channels, but then also thinking about what are my other levers to increase LTV that are a little bit deeper in the chain. So think about things like lifecycle marketing, right? So at some point, lifecycle marketing ends up being that thing that can really help with retention and really help with conversion rates and things like that, right? Especially if the initial acquisition didn't get it done. Because there's this one thing you see a lot in scaled up marketing orgs where there's a lot of disclaiming of responsibility if you don't have people who are looking at the entire continuum, right? And you see this especially in like B2B SaaS businesses, right? Like the sales team is like, well, the marketing team just needs to send us better leads. The marketing team is like, well, you just need to close leads, right? And there's just complete blame game that goes on, right? You need as much agency over that continuum as possible.
That's actually a great thing I'd love to, talk about a little bit more. Can you talk to me about the structure of the user acquisition team and the sort of like what other cross-functional teams you were able to work with?
Yeah, I think data science is the biggest one, right? If you really want to level up your acquisition team, go and work with the data science team because you need to have a really dispassionate view of what's happening in the business at any given time from a user standpoint, but also just from a usage standpoint, right? It's not just the customers that you're bringing in, but how are they actually increasing in value? Are they increasing in value? Is their LTV actually decreasing? Why might they be decreasing? There's a lot of in the weeds details that you really want to understand, and sometimes from just a pure marketing standpoint, you're not going to get that view. You really have to go and work with product folks. You have to go and work with data folks to make sure that you're doing that if you're not yourself a data person, which again, I would encourage any marketer out there who really wants to level up to go and become basically a data person. If you can go for your own data and understand what is happening deeper in the chain, you're going to be a 10Xer.
That is music to my ears. Are there marketing metrics that you find are really, trap metrics or metrics that are just terrible to look at?
Traffic. I think traffic is just an awful metric. Like, it's fine. I understand if you want to understand what is coming in at the top of the funnel, but truly, if you can get your conversion up just one like small percentage point or 2 percentage points, like that creates compounding growth, right? All things being equal. Like, and I think there's way too much attention paid. Now, again, I say this as somebody who's really focused on acquisition for a large portion of my career. I think there's way too much attention placed on where these users are coming from, how they're coming into the funnel, what channel. I think this idea of like attribution was something we detrimentally relied on in a previous, life. I really do think you have to focus on conversion. You have to focus on usage because if you think about driving 100 people into your product and it works for 50% of them versus driving, 1,000 in and it working for 5% of them, right? The former is obviously a lot less work. You just have to get that product working a little bit better and have it working a little bit harder. And that really indicates a product market fit. Let's face it. You have to find something that people can't live without, as opposed to sort of ramrodding something down somebody's throat and hoping that some small percentage of them actually use it.
And on the attribution topic, what does that look like for you? Like, how would you advise founders to look at it today?
Yeah, I think today you want to be taking a much broader view of acquisition and especially attribution of that acquisition. Once upon a time, I think we had this idea that we are going to very specifically be able to attribute every single user down to every single touch point, right? This was the multi-touch era where people started building these really complicated, I would argue marginally useful models where it's like multi-touch, right? I will know the 30 touch points this person had before they even reach my product. And of course, only at a certain point did we step back and say, is that even useful? What can we do with that? Can we actually orchestrate 30 different touch points if that's my best user of all time? And the answer is absolutely not. Like, there's no way you're going to orchestrate that. That just was happenstance, and you just need to take it as such. And what I think we're now, well, at least the world we're now in, now that we have started to deprecate ATT framework, and we now have much less visibility in terms of every single, never mind like the user journey, we don't even know what source you came from. We now have to think about things in a very blended way, right? This is kind of taking us back several decades to the way marketing used to work, right? You put a lot of things in a market and you would know whether it was resonant because suddenly your numbers would tick up in a very meaningful way. And so I like to use this phrase, but if you're not sure if something's working, it probably isn't. And the reason why is because it's not creating a big enough impact out of the gate to really prove itself, right? The onus is on that thing you're putting out there to then create a step function change in your growth. And if it's not, well, it's probably not working the way that you think it is.
I love that. And we could keep going for another few hours. I mean, it's very rare that I get someone this much expertise in user acquisition and marketplaces, but I just want to thank you, Adam, for your time. It's been fantastic having you. And yeah, maybe we run this back in another year to hear how your contrarian takes have still held up.
Let's do it. I'm forming them all the time.
I love it. Thank you again, Adam. And to everyone else, thank you. Take care. Thanks for tuning into Experimental. If today's insights sparked new ideas or made you feel like a smarter marketer, consider leaving a review on your preferred podcast platform. It really helps support the show. For more in-depth discussions and resources, visit experimental.beehive.com. Until next time, be curious and stay experimental.